John Quincy Adams, Monroe's Secretary of State, feared that Spain might try to regain its former colonies, and in 1823 he drafted a speech for the president that became known as the Monroe Doctrine. This doctrine stated that the United States would oppose any future efforts by European powers to colonize the Americas, would abstain from involvement in Europe's wars, and would prevent European nations from interfering in the new Latin American nations. This doctrine assumed that the Old and New World were separate political and diplomatic systems, and claimed for the United States the role of the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere. Adams also meant to secure the commerce of the region for the United States, as opposed to British interest. In the 1820s, a new party alignment emerged in Kentucky and the nation. In the election of 1824, with no political party to contend against, the Democrat-Republicans turned on themselves and ran 4 candidates for the presidency: John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, Henry Clay, and William H. Crawford. The election resulted in no one winning an electoral majority, and the election was thrown into the House of Representatives. Once the election was thrown into the House, each state got 1 vote, regardless of how their citizens voted. In the end, John Quincy Adams won the presidency, though he had lost the popular vote and had come in second to Jackson on the electoral vote. He nominated his fellow candidate in 1824, Henry Clay, who was also the Speaker of the House, to be his Secretary of State. As most past presidents had served as Secretary of State, Jackson perceived this as a corrupt bargain struck by the two, whereby Clay would use his influence in the House to secure Adams the presidency, and Clay in turn would be made heir apparent. And just a map showing the presidential election of 1824. Again, just showing the votes, Jackson and Adams. Jackson, 38% of the vote. Adams, 32% of the electoral vote. Again, Jackson also won the popular vote, but again, he didn't have, there was no majority vote. He didn't win enough of the majority electoral votes to become president. And just a picture of the presidential, or a cartoon of the presidential race of 1824. John Quincy Adams, William Crawford, and Andrew Jackson stride to the finish line, while Henry Clay lags behind. So you can just kind of see them running, and Mr. Clay's in no hurry. Just a picture of Mr. Adams. John Quincy, he was a hard worker. He was one of the most intelligent presidents to serve in the White House. He was ambassador to 4 European nations. He was a U.S. senator, a Harvard professor. He assisted with negotiating the end of the War of 1812. Again, he drafted the Monroe Doctrine. However, despite all of his accomplishments, he was an ineffective leader. He was stubborn, and he once stated that women had nothing to do with politics. So you can only imagine his surprise if he were alive today, with women being in politics, running for president, vice president, Senate, governor, just in the different areas of politics. John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams, the second president, came from a privileged background and had experience as a diplomat and senator in the U.S. Congress. Just again, despite his uncharismatic nature, John Quincy was a strong nationalist. He supported the American system of government-sponsored economic development. As the author of the Monroe Doctrine, he wanted to increase American commerce and power in the Western Hemisphere, and hoped that the United States would eventually incorporate Canada, Cuba, and part of Mexico. Adams had a much larger view of federal power than many at that time. He thought the federal government should direct and sponsor internal improvements, such as road and canals, pass laws to promote agriculture, manufacturing, and the arts, and establish a national university and a naval academy. At a time when many Americans believed government power threatened freedom, Adams argued that liberty is power. His ideas horrified believers in strict construction, who wanted a limited role for the federal government, and Congress approved few of his programs. Some of his ideas, such as a national university and the adoption of the metric system of measurements, have yet to be implemented. Adams rallied in opposition around Andrew Jackson, dedicated to individual liberty, states' rights, and limited government. Jackson's campaign, organized by Martin Van Buren, a New York senator, started immediately after Adams took office. While Adams typified an old politics in which elites ruled, Van Buren, the son of a tavern keeper, represented a new era in American politics in which ordinary men could become party managers and professionals and wield great power. Van Buren believed political parties and party competition were legitimate and good for the republic by checking the power of administrations and offering voters choices. He also believed parties would suppress sectionalism by bringing together supporters and candidates from all across the country. Van Buren was alarmed by the sectionalism inspired by the slavery question in the Missouri debates, and he hoped to resurrect the Jeffersonian alliance between Southern planters and Northern farmers and urban workers. By 1828, Van Buren had established the political apparatus of the Democratic Party, with local and state units overseen by a national committee, and newspapers devoted to the party. Adams disdained political organization, refused to dismiss federal office holders who campaigned for Jackson, and did little to promote his own reelection. Outside of a commitment to limited government, Jackson's campaign made few promises, but instead relied on his popularity and party machinery. Jackson's supporters disdained Adams' intellectual attainments and accused him of having mistresses while serving as a diplomat in Europe, while simultaneously praising Jackson's frontier manliness. Jackson's opponents condemned his having executed army deserters and questioned the morality of his wife Rachel for marrying him before her divorce was final. Jackson blamed the scandal for her death shortly after the election. By 1828, voters rather than legislatures chose electors in all states except for South Carolina, which helped to encourage campaigning and higher voter turnout. Jackson won an astounding victory, carrying the entire South and West, as well as Pennsylvania. The election was the first to demonstrate how universal white male suffrage had transformed American politics, and for better or worse, the United States entered the age of Jackson. And again, I'll let you kind of look at this. I got ahead of myself on the slides there. I just kept talking and then clicked to the next slide. I remember as I was working on my master's, my professor, he did his doctoral thesis on Andrew Jackson. So he knew everything about President Jackson. And so when it was time for me to select a paper to write, I made sure to stay away from Mr. Jackson and the banks because that was my professor's, again, his thesis, and he knew everything front, backwards, all about it. There was one student who did it on the banking system. So his paper turned out, he did pretty good on his paper. He scored a decent grade. He just had to find some different information that perhaps the professor didn't know, some minor detail. So he took a chance by writing something that the professor knew a lot about, which I would not recommend on a topic that you write something that your professor may have done a doctoral thesis on. Again, I personally just stayed away from that. Just a map showing the presidential election of 1828. This time, Jackson had the majority of the electoral votes, and again, he also won the popular vote. As you can kind of see at this time, and Andrew Jackson was a Democrat in the states that were Democrat at the time. And this is a broadside from the 1828 campaign illustrating how Andrew Jackson's supporters promoted him as a military hero and as a man of the people. As you can kind of see, Jackson Forever, the hero of two wars and of Orleans, also known as Old Hickory. Kind of just lets you read the rest of that. And that concludes chapter 9.